Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of Reasonable Minds Can Differ. Hopefully just as good as the first one, but also hopefully a little bit shorter. If you weren't here with us last week, you didn't see that Reasonable Minds Can Differ, the pilot episode, was about 2 hours long. Honestly, that's not what I'm aimed at here. I think that's a little bit too long for these conversations. We are going to be aiming these episodes of conversation, difference, and debate at about an hour long. We're going to start with a first section where I present the various propositions that I have for everybody in front of them. And then we're going to move to a second section where everybody can be free to disagree with me or fellow people in the chat as much or as little as they want. The only caveat I have to that entire process is that everybody should treat each other with respect and dignity. That's what we do here in Reasonable Minds Can Differ. The entire emphasis is on the fact that we can have differences of opinion because we have different values. We analyze facts differently. But that doesn't mean that the person we are disagreeing with across the aisle or otherwise is subhuman, less than worthy of our consideration and respect. So that's how we're going to do it on this show. We're going to do it just like we did last week. The only difference is that the second half of the show is now called the Difference Dome, not because we're going to attack each other like Mel Gibson movies of days past, but because I wanted to have something alliterative and I really like the word dome. So now it's the Difference Dome. When we get there, you'll know it. But for right now, we're going to talk about the issue of the day, which is the freedom of speech in America, the firing/not firing of Jimmy Kimmel from his show on ABC, and what that all means to both. So stick with us. We've got a lot to talk about. Hopefully I hit the right buttons, and then we can get deep into the conversation. But as I said last week when we started this show, if you want a super chat, that's great. I will collect those when we start the Difference Dome, but don't feel like you have to. And there will be a Q&A box opened up for those conversations in the second half. I won't be otherwise commenting on or checking in on the chat while I give the presentation of background. So with that all said, let's begin. If I can hit these buttons correctly. You never know with me. Background. Very clear. So if you didn't follow any of this story before, this is not a Hangouts and Headlines episode. We're not going to go through line by line and analyze everything a journalist does. But this is an article from Esquire that's going to help us summarize what happened with Jimmy Kimmel, the FCC, freedom of speech, and everything in between. So as this article is titled, Everything We Know About Why Jimmy Kimmel Was Taken Off the Air. Here's what the late night host said, why ABC decided to air his show again, and what all of this means for the future of TV under the Trump administration. Now, that's pretty grand. That's pretty broad. I'm not sure any article in Esquire or anywhere else can tell you what all of this means for the future of TV under the Trump administration, but I appreciate the ambition. Reach for the stars, kids. Strive. Jimmy Kimmel is back on the air. ABC announced on Monday that Jimmy Kimmel Live is returning on Tuesday night following what the network called thoughtful conversations about his suspension last week. So we'll get to that. We're starting a little bit at the end of this story here at the top of this article. But yes, after I hit the button to have this conversation with you all, it was announced by ABC that they were going to bring the Jimmy Kimmel, I think it's just Live as his late night show title, back on air tonight, Tuesday night. Now, there's more to that story than even that suggests, so we'll get to that in just a minute. But last Wednesday, we made the decision to suspend production on the show to avoid further inflaming a tense situation at an emotional moment for our country, a spokesman for ABC told Deadline. It is a decision we made because we felt some of the comments were ill-timed and thus insensitive. We have spent the last days having thoughtful conversations with Jimmy. Facts not in evidence, but we'll assume that Jimmy can in fact have thoughtful conversations. And after those conversations, we reached the decision to return the show on Tuesday, aka tonight. For those who might have missed the news last week, it's all right, editors are cool. ABC announced on Wednesday evening that it would cease airing new episodes of Jimmy Kimmel Live until further notice. As it turns out, that notice was less than a week later. The network and its parent company, Disney, acted after complaints from conservative viewers, and the Federal Communications Commission accused the late-night host of inaccurate reporting regarding the assassination of right-wing personality Charlie Kirk, which, of course, was the topic of conversation in our first episode of Reasonable Minds Can Differ. The abrupt move, which ABC's George Stephanopoulos concisely described as having a sharply polarized response on Good Morning America Thursday morning, resulted in a battle between political figures and celebrities over how the current administration and the FCC are taking direct action to police networks that do not align with the MAGA movement. Kimmel's brief hiatus followed Donald Trump's lawsuits against 60 Minutes and the New York Times, as well as CBS's cancellation of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. So that's the overall what's going on. But what was this even all about? On last Monday night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live, the Late Show host began his opening monologue by discussing the suspect who allegedly shot and killed Charlie Kirk at a Utah Valley University event on September 10th. The joke, as it was as follows. We hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them, and doing everything they can to score political points from it, Kimmel said. Now, a lot of people read that as Jimmy Kimmel saying essentially that Charlie Kirk's shooter was a MAGA fan. I don't know that there's any other way to reasonably read it, except that under the law, when we talk about things that are false or not false, you would note that he doesn't actually make the accusation directly here. There are things you can get in trouble for making indirect kind of accusations. We saw that in, among other things, the Depp v. Heard trial a few years back. But overall, from a purely black and white perspective, he doesn't say the shooter is MAGA. He says essentially the opposite in a joking tone to suggest that he was MAGA. But that's angels on the head of a pen at the end of the day. People read it the way I think it was intended to be read when he was writing that joke or his staff was writing that joke. And this got him in a fair amount of trouble. In between the grieving on Friday, the White House flew their flags at half-staff, which got some criticism, he continued. But on a human level, you can see how hard the president is taking this. The Late Show host then played a clip of Trump answering questions from the press about how he was holding up following Kirk's death. Trump responds, saying that he was very good, before shifting the conversation to talk about the construction of the White House's new ballroom. He's at the fourth state of grief, construction, Kimmel joked. This is not how an adult grieves the murder of someone he called a friend. This is how a 4-year-old mourns a goldfish. You can watch the full video below. Now, reasonable minds can differ certainly as to whether or not any of that is funny. But if you think it's funny, great. If you don't think it's funny, also great. This is what Jimmy Kimmel got in trouble for saying. In an interview with right-wing podcaster Benny Johnson, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr stated that Kimmel's monologue was a concerted effort to lie to the American people. Carr took the most offense to Kimmel labeling the shooter as a MAGA conservative, which he doesn't directly, as we just talked about, which he called a very, very serious issue. Last Monday, Vice President J.D. Vance stated that he believed left-wing extremism was part of the reason Kirk was killed. Republicans in the MAGA movement have since echoed his claims, pointing to the suspect's alleged radical left-leaning. Now, as we talked about last week in the first episode of RMCD, I don't know that it matters all that much what political persuasion an assassin actually has on this score. Now, we can try to fix the country in any number of different ways, and there's certainly a lot of hay that is being tossed around from right to left and left to right about who's responsible for this person. In general, at the point in time where you are out there assassinating people of any stripe, but especially people that are speaking on college campuses, you already have, and I'm going to put this as delicately as possible, a screw loose, right? So yes, there are certainly things that the political environment in the United States can do to contribute to the folks with the screw loose being more likely to act on those loose screws. And I think that's really what the fight is about online right now. But whether or not he's right-wing or left-wing really kind of defeats the most important argument, which is you shouldn't be shooting people, especially shooting people just for saying things that you disagree with, right? I don't even make that a proposition here. I don't really think it's all that controversial. It was a proposition last week that essentially political violence is wrong. And it does concern when you see a lot of people online saying it's okay if the guy was bad enough. We talked about that last week. We're not going to go over that ground again. But overall, the more important conversation to my eyes is killing versus not killing, violence versus not violence, over left versus right. Some people will take the next step and say, well, one side or the other is more violent or more pro-murder than the other side is. And that's a reasonable conversation to get in at some level, but I do think it misses the forest for the trees. So with that said, on my behalf, without even getting into the presentment portion of our conversation today, that's the state of play. And the big thing that really jumped out at me, the reason I was commenting on this on social media when it happened last week and this weekend, was this notion of the FCC. So if you aren't familiar with the Federal Communications Commission, it is basically, in American terms, an ancient body that was designed around allocating the limited bandwidth available through radio frequencies to broadcast radio shows and then television shows over the air with those frequencies. That the government gives a monopoly to various forces that we know of in America right now as ABC, CBS, and NBC, various radio affiliates to put those talk shows out. and gives them permission to do that through the power of government and prohibits everyone else from operating on those same wavelengths. And so the FCC can go and police the use of those wavelengths, and that's what it does. Now, if that sounds to you like, doesn't that present certain issues under the First Amendment and the restriction on the U.S. government from doing anything at all regarding the freedom of speech? Yes, it obviously does. It obviously gets even more problematic when you have the FCC chairman going on podcasts and saying, essentially, this looks like you were lying to the American people. I've got a duty to make sure that your content is in the public interest, and various other things that he says as part of this. So we can do this the easy way or the hard way, Chairman Carr continued. These companies can find ways to change conduct and take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead. And if you listen to that commentary and you don't kind of see the image of the enforcers in The Godfather coming into the jewelry store and just kind of knocking their bats on the jewelry cases and saying it's a shame if anything were to happen here, I don't know what to tell you. This is absolute mobster talk from the chairman of the FCC. Now, it's notable that this is not an official action. This is not the FCC acting by rule or by board meeting or anything in between. This is one guy on what I understand to be a fairly right-wing podcast saying it would be a shame if anything were to happen to these guys and their licenses, since it's the only way they make money. But I have a problem with that as a stance overall, because I do believe very deeply in the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression. And while we have this kind of unusual relationship between the government and over-the-air broadcasters, I don't think the government should just be going out and saying, well, it's a privilege that you have that we've bestowed upon you. You should make sure you're saying what we want you to say. I don't think that's a good relationship for the government and these private entities to be involved in. And that's realistically where the fight comes in. But a lot of people online are talking about whether or not this actually constitutes FCC, what the term is, which I hate, under the law is jawboning, essentially coercing private actors to do what they cannot, because the government absolutely cannot restrict speech. If Chairman Carr were to just go in there and say, I've taken over your broadcast network and we're only going to show Charlie Kirk memorials and we're only going to show Republican talking points, we're only going to show Donald Trump in a field of flowers with lights all around it, that would be a problem. That is the government telling you what you can hear and see. And we agree, I think, on the whole, that would be an issue for the U.S. government to do. But equally problematic is the U.S. government saying, well, we're not going to do that directly, but if you don't do that, then we're going to take away your license and then maybe give it to someone who will do that, right? You arrive in the same place, and we can't, as a society, have our government saying, here are the rules under which we operate, such as the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law infringing the freedom of speech, and say, well, okay, that's fine, but there's a lot of ways we can infringe the freedom of speech going around the horn. That's not okay. The U.S. jurisprudence, other governments' jurisprudence has demonstrated that that's not okay. You can't get to the same place by doing something different. You can't go through a loophole to get to that point in time. That's the conversation that we're having today, even as we're also talking about Jimmy Kimmel coming back on. And so it wasn't an official government action. It wasn't an official government restriction. It was essentially putting pressure on ABC and Disney to do what they wanted, not ordering them to do what they wanted under pain of being thrown in prison or having the tanks roll in or anything else. It is what you might see online described as a slippery slope. And slippery slope you might also see argued against as a logical fallacy. I will tell you right now, the slippery slope is a logical fallacy only if you are trying to make the claim that it is a necessity, that when something happens, it will absolutely go down that slippery slope. It is not a fallacy to say, hey, we should note there's a slope here. This is potentially a problem, and we should maybe take actions to prevent us from even going down or engaging with that slope. That is not the fallacy. And so people get this confused online all the time. This is one of those things I wanted to talk to you all about when we have this conversation, but that's getting a little bit ahead of the story here. That's one of the propositions we're going to talk about. And so let's just finish up this description of what happened. Why did ABC take Kimmel off the air? The network briefly explained its decision when they announced that Kimmel would return. A spokesman stated that some of the comments were ill-timed and thus insensitive during a tense situation at an emotional moment for our country. At the time, the New York Times described Disney's actions as an extraordinary exertion of political pressure on a major broadcast network by the Trump administration. The move followed comments made by Nexstar Media and Sinclair Broadcast Group, and this aspect is not talked about enough, the two largest owners of TV stations in the country. So these are the guys that actually own the towers that broadcast things over the air, right? ABC makes content, and they have a network of affiliates that make sure that that content gets into your home. But these are the guys that actually own the infrastructure to do that. They strongly object to recent comments made by Mr. Kimmel concerning the killing of Charlie Kirk and will replace the show with other programming in its ABC-affiliated markets. Meanwhile, Sinclair announced its plans to replace Kimmel's usual time slot with a Charlie Kirk tribute special. According to Variety, Sinclair has long had a reputation for having a political conservative tilt. Why, Esquire, would you need to quote Variety on what the political tilt is of this affiliate network? But that's more of a Hangouts and Headlines kind of conversation, so we'll leave that to the side for right now. Mr. Kimmel's remarks were inappropriate and deeply insensitive at a critical moment for our country. We believe broadcasters have a responsibility to educate and elevate respectful, constructive dialogue in our communities. We appreciate FCC Chairman Carr's remarks today, and this incident highlights the critical need for the FCC to take immediate regulatory action to address control held over local broadcasters by the big national networks. So that's realistically a quote that exposes what this is all about, right? So these affiliates are in contracts with the content providers like ABC or NBC or CBS, and those contracts are very specific about what they have to air from the content provider to get any content at all. And essentially, this is a fight between the affiliates and the network about what those contracts should require of them when they don't think that they are otherwise beneficial to their constituency. And they are using the fact that the FCC is willing to go out there with their chairman onto these podcasts and say these various things to try to establish a better leverage point for future contract negotiations. And look, I'm a corporate transactions attorney, right? That is where I see these things happen in the world. And so I'm telling you that when I read a quote like this, what I'm seeing writ large is essentially a contract negotiation taking place with all of these aspects really ancillary to it. And the fact that social media will take up all these things and have these outraged discussions about these facts is helpful to these conversations on one or the other side, but maybe not helpful to you or I operating in the world, right? So don't get caught up in social media fights. Don't get caught up in culture outrage, because there's almost always something else going on behind the scenes on these topics. And realistically, neither Sinclair or Nexstar are talking about Jimmy Kimmel as much as they're talking about contracts. And as we will see in the next paragraph, mergers. Variety also reported that Nexstar is currently awaiting FCC approval on a pending deal to acquire another broadcast company, Tenga, for roughly $6.2 billion. Nice if you can get it. Per the outlet, a Nexstar spokesman declined to comment on whether that pending deal played a role in the company's decision-making. The unstated allegation here being that essentially kissing up to the Trump administration might be useful to getting a merger approved when the U.S. government otherwise has veto rights over that merger. And that would, again, be the FCC holding those veto rights. So the fact that the chairman goes out there and says these things is important to both of these conversations. And that's without even getting into whether or not you think Jimmy Kimmel is funny, whether or not you think his statements were outrageous or unfair. This is just what's happening in the behind the scenes of how the government is operating. ABC's decision, Esquire points out, is eerily similar to Stephen Colbert's cancellation. Now, I don't know that that's in fact true. When CBS decided to cancel The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, many news outlets pointed to the FCC holding up Skydance's acquisition of Paramount. At the same time, Deadline reported that the network likely settled Donald Trump's lawsuit against 60 Minutes to curry favor with the FCC. So essentially, naked allegations of these things look untoward. They have the appearance of impropriety, but no actual evidence that these things were untoward, that there was actual impropriety that's happening, right? And this is one of those aspects that we're going to talk about later on. It's one of my propositions, so get excited for that. But the appearance of impropriety is often as important as the impropriety itself, as these reporters and these outlets are all too willing to grant in this particular circumstance. Americans no longer trust the legacy national news media to report fully, accurately, and fairly. It is time for a change, Chairman Carr wrote in a statement at the time. That's why I welcome Skydance's commitment to make significant changes at the once storied CBS broadcast network. And again, this is the guy that goes out there and says, nice license you have there. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to it. What happens now? Jimmy Kimmel's coming back tonight. We'll see what he does, I guess. How does the public respond as it does controversially in a non-unified manner. That's how they responded. That's the background of what's happening today. We also see Benny Johnson, the podcast host that had Carr on, quoting him. We're on a cable show right now. You don't have an FCC license. You don't have an obligation to serve the public interest. Podcasts don't either. Stand-up comedians, whether they're on lots of forms of communications, don't, and Kimmel is free to do that. Essentially, he doesn't need his TV show broadcast over the airwaves. He can go on a podcast or he can go online. That's all true, but that actually defeats Chairman Carr and the entire FCC's existence primary reason for being, which is to say, if we aren't really that limited in the ways that we can speak to each other, and we really aren't, as demonstrated by this StreamYard YouTube streaming video where we can discuss these things between you and I without the FCC having one say one way or the other, then what is the FCC even doing here? But, continues Chairman Carr, if you have a broadcast TV license, that means you have something that very few people have, and you're excluding other people from having access to that valuable public resource. And it comes with an obligation to serve the public interest. That's true. That's true insofar as it goes, but it doesn't go very far because the First Amendment is still more important than the Federal Communications Act, and the FCC darn well knows this. Even while he's saying these things, he knows that he has a bit of his statute that says you can check to see whether licensees are acting in the public interest, but that probably doesn't mean that you can go and police the content that they have on their channels. We're going to talk more about that as part of this conversation, et cetera, et cetera. He continues on. We don't need to grab any of that. I did want to make one other thing clear. There was a lot of conversation online that what the FCC was saying here is that Jimmy Kimmel's not allowed to broadcast hoaxes. That's patently absurd. The quotes that I just made to you from the Esquire article are not hoaxes. The provision in this particular bit of federal rules of regulations says no licensee, meaning an over-the-air broadcast network or permittee of any broadcast station, shall broadcast false information concerning a crime or a catastrophe if the licensee knows this information is false. Number one, it is foreseeable that broadcast of the information will cause substantial public harm. Number two, and the broadcast actually does cause that harm, right? So when we talk about hoaxes, the very first most important thing is it has to be false. And when we talk about somebody's political leanings, it's very difficult to establish truth or falsity in any respect, right? Again, going back to how we will have talked about defamation in general together, which is an exception to the First Amendment, there needs to be this aspect of an actual quantifiable lie. We don't, for a fact, know what the political persuasion of Charlie Kirk's alleged shooter is. We don't know it for a number of reasons. One, because it's hard to know it about anybody. You know, you come into the comments and tell me what my political persuasion is, and you can use all sorts of evidence to argue either side of the aisle for me. Hopefully, that's realistically how I treat my life. So I think that's how it would work in practice. But outside of that, this is a person that chose to assassinate someone in daylight, in public. So there's already a question of mental faculty and all these other things that go along with this. So that's the nature of you can't broadcast hoaxes. It's really designed around the kind of war of the worlds you're going to put on the radio that aliens are attacking farmhouses in Kansas and create some kind of panic that is going to hurt people, burn down things, and otherwise distract the use of public services like fire and police. That's what a hoax really is. Now, that doesn't mean the FCC doesn't have any powers at all. The FCC does have powers, as we talk about in this space and in others, to prevent certain words from being said on air, not for their content, right? They can't go on and say you can't say the F word if you're saying it about our president, but you can say it in any other context. You just can't say the F word because we've decided as a society that that's obscene for purposes of over-the-air broadcast. Now, is that in and of itself kind of ridiculous with all of the internet facing channels and all the various ways that you can get to go have people swear in your face as much or as little as you want? Yes, it still is. The FCC is an antiquated body that is out there enforcing norms from the 1930s and not doing so in a terribly effective way. But all of this conversation about, the FCC is just acting within its ambit is wrong. And we're going to talk about that more as we proceed here. I'm almost done with background, folks. Thanks for sitting with me here. I did want to point out, as mentioned at the top of that Esquire article, Jimmy Kimmel's suspension is over. Some people are using that to say, well, then the FCC really didn't do anything and the Trump administration / FCC didn't do anything wrong. I'm going to argue in this video that that is not, in fact, the case, that even going out there and running the baseball bat over the jewelry case is in and of itself a problem. for the U.S. government and what they are doing here, whether or not they actually had an order for ABC and Disney to take him off the air, which it is evident they didn't. And I think was evident at the time that they didn't. You can do a lot with government or other power simply by making suggestions and not by making orders. And we can't have the U.S. government operating in that form or fashion and still be considered a free people. Now, on top of that story, I did promise you one other update. Sinclair, one of those affiliate networks we talked about as part of our article read, has said that even though ABC is bringing back Jimmy Kimmel, they're not going to air Jimmy Kimmel. And again, it's their choice. They have the infrastructure. So they are instead going to air news until they get whatever they're looking for as their pound of flesh from ABC, whether that's an apology. One of them, I think it was Sinclair, mentioned that they might want Jimmy Kimmel to make a donation to Turning Point, which was Charlie Kirk's organization. We don't know how that's all going to work in the long run, but Sinclair is saying we're not going to air it. I don't know how their contracts work with ABC. That might be its own problem, but ABC is not going to be willing in all likelihood to sue for breach at this point in time on this particular subject, so they might be taking their bet there. But that's the state of play as it stands right now, which brings us to our first proposition. Proposition number one, Jimmy Kimmel has the legal right to say whatever he wants, right? The freedom of speech in America is you can say whatever you want as long as it doesn't cross very, very specific bright lines. And that's lying about someone to their damage, which you can't really do to the deceased, but he's not even lying to or about Charlie Kirk as much as he might or might not be lying about the alleged assassin of Charlie Kirk. And as long as you aren't defaming them in some way, you're not going to run afoul of these various rules. Also, there's restrictions on direct incitements to violence, right? And this is one area where the online infrastructure also gets confused, which is to say, even if you're out there on Twitter or Blue Sky or Facebook saying, good job, assassin, Donald Trump should be next, that is not a direct call for violence. The incitement of violence needs to have a direct proximate relationship to your language under the jurisprudence of the United States, which is to say, if you instead say, hey, there's a rifle in my upstairs window and Donald Trump is standing on the corner that you can see from it, that's a little bit different from just in general, I want these politicians dead, or you did a good job, it's a good start, or Charlie Kirk was a bad person, or whatever else these people are saying. So Jimmy Kimmel, 100%, has the legal right to say what he wants. That's proposition one. I doubt we're going to have a lot of argument about that when we get to the difference dome, but that's proposition one. Proposition two, very similar. Disney has the legal right to fire him. Disney has the legal right to suspend him. Disney has the legal right to say, it's our freedom of speech that we do not want to platform those pieces of conversation. If, as the Hollywood Reporter wound up reporting, you're unwilling to give the apology we are demanding of you, we have the legal right to take any steps that we want. You saw this, especially a few years back online, as the concept of you have the freedom of speech. The government cannot imprison you. It cannot otherwise penalize you in these various ways. But that doesn't mean you have freedom from consequence, right? So if you're on social media, you're saying something that looks negatively for your employer, then your employer has the opportunity to say, no, that's not okay with us. This goes back to the proposition last week that I made that cancel culture is complicated. I have long advocated for going and saying, I don't want to purchase that product because your employees have done something that I really don't like. In the age of social media, that means that you can effect a boycott and get that message all the way up to the employer. And sometimes they fire the person so that you'll still buy their product or service. And that has gotten to be a little bit stronger than I think it was ever intended to be, honestly, before social media. And so I do think it's a complicated question. But Jimmy Kimmel has the right to say what he wants. Disney has the right to say, we're not going to platform you, pay your salary, or anything in between if that's what they want. But on top of both of those things, the FCC chair threatened Disney directly or indirectly. This is a proposition that I wouldn't think would be that controversial, except that I know from being online that a lot of people think that the FCC chair was just kind of spouting nonsense on these podcasts and in these cable TV interviews. And I would say that even if it wasn't an official act, the U.S. government, any body with power over another, has to be more concerned about how it is that they look, the optics that they generate, because that is as important, the sanctity of government, the belief that they are operating in some kind of facially neutral capacity. That FCC chair, while appointed by political parties, is not a political individual in and of himself. We can't have a practice of law, a rule of law, that is so nakedly partisan and opportunistic, because that ruins how everybody winds up feeling about the rule of law overall. So that's Proposition 3. This was an actual threat. It's something to be concerned about. You can't just gloss over it just because Jimmy Kimmel is going to be back on your TV network tonight, or not, if you're in the Sinclair affiliate range. So that's Proposition 1 through 3. And yet we still have more to talk about even on those propositions because, as I said, there is a question of how the FCC interacted with all this. As Hollywood Reporter reports through Yahoo Entertainment, I don't know how all these contracts work, I'd be honest, the joke kicked off a social media shitstorm. A source with information tells the Hollywood Reporter, and maybe the FCC would be mad at me about saying that if I were on ABC, but I am not. I'm on YouTube. It died down temporarily. But almost immediately after FCC Chair Brendan Carr's appearance on Benny Johnson's podcast, the storm became a bigger swirl. Within hours, multiple ABC station owners held calls with senior Disney leadership expressing their concern with the comments, a second source tells the Hollywood Reporter. Inside of ABC, multiple conversations with Kimmel were held at the executive level. The first person says, though the talks had not yet reached Bob Iger, the CEO, or TV head Dana Walden. The execs wanted to know, how was Kimmel going to address the situation on Wednesday night's show? Spoiler alert, he wasn't. Not really. He was going to demur, not apologize, and say he was essentially being misunderstood. We're going to skip that entire conversation, but just to note that the order of events as reported by the Hollywood Reporter is that it was dying down, and then Chairman Carr started talking about it, right? So people online are using this particular article to say, well, the FCC wasn't a big issue here because ABC made the decision on their own. Yes, of course, ABC made the decision on their own, but timing matters. And it certainly looks like FCC chair going out and saying these things affected ABC and Disney's willingness to take this action. And you can feel however you want about the action that was taken, whether it was appropriate or not. But the FCC got in here and muddied the waters. They threatened, and it is a problem. Why? Because, as I said, Proposition 4, and this is probably the most difficult one for people to grapple with, is that the appearance of impropriety is as bad as impropriety itself. Said another way, had Carr called up ABC head and Disney head directly and said, you're going to do this or we're going to strip your license away, that is as bad as going on a podcast and saying, well, we might just have to have a talk about stripping their license away. Because when we're talking about the rule of law, when we're talking about these positions of public trust, like the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, it is just as bad to look like you're a mobster as it is to be a mobster, because we need to have faith in these processes working. And when we talk about these things, that is as important as the actual act of being just itself. Or as I believe this is the Hawaiian rules of jurisprudence say, an independent, fair, and impartial judiciary is indispensable to our system of justice. Now, this is talking about judges and the courts, not the FCC, but we're using an analogy here. The United States legal system is based upon the principle that an independent, impartial, and competent judiciary composed of men and women of integrity will interpret and apply the law that governs our society. Judges should maintain the dignity of judicial office at all times and avoid both impropriety, the doing of bad things, and the appearance of impropriety in their professional and personal lives. They should aspire at all times to conduct that ensures the greatest possible public confidence in their independence, impartiality, integrity, and competence. You need to be above reproach. You can't offer even a crack in the veneer of blind justice, because when you do so, everyone starts to look at this and say, well, actually, the justice system is just human beings, isn't it? And so should we even be listening to the justice system? Is there a rule of law? And yes, the FCC is in a different role, but it is a similar role of public-facing trust. And if I can impart anything to you watching this or listening to this later, it is that these roles are of supreme importance for maintaining the thin veneer of civilized society, and that if I have an objection to the way the Trump administration operates, it is that they tend to walk around and make these kinds of half-mobster statements, and then if they don't want to really dive fully into the impropriety side of the pool, will say, oh, I was just saying things on Benny Johnson or otherwise. That's not good enough for me. The appearance of impropriety, just as bad as impropriety itself. Or, as the advisory committee, I think in California, says about this very same rule, public confidence in the judiciary is eroded by irresponsible or improper conduct. A judge must avoid all impropriety and appearance of impropriety. A judge must expect to be the subject of constant public scrutiny. A judge must therefore accept restrictions on the judge's conduct that might be viewed as burdensome by other members of the community and should do so freely and willingly. So another way, this isn't fair, right? You're a human being. You're a judge. You're otherwise taking on a job just like anybody else is taking on a job, but we're going to require more of you because the structures of society demand it. And that is what is demanded from a position like FCC chair. This is the kind of thing where I would be looking at removal, resignation, impeachment, or otherwise. And that's how I see it. You don't have to agree with me on this. As I said in the first episode, but I failed to repeat at the top of this one, every assertion I make in these propositions or otherwise should be read with that hashtag in the corner. Reasonable minds can differ. I expect you to differ with me when we get to the difference dome, but I feel this very strongly that this appearance of impropriety is very, very bad overall, regardless of what they did behind the scenes on this particular topic. Now, that leads us to, I believe, the last proposition. The FCC confused matters and did in fact threaten the freedom of speech. Right? Just by doing this, just by going out there with the chairman, saying these things on a podcast, they threaten the freedom of speech, even though the law gets complicated on this topic. And we're going to talk about that complication right now, which is to say, we're going to talk about something called the Fairness Doctrine, or as Time put it in February of 2009, and get ready for a little bit of head whipping for what side of the political spectrum you're on here. It's as predictable as Rush Limbaugh sparking a controversy. Every few years, someone in Congress brings up the Fairness Doctrine. In 1987, the FCC abolished the policy which dictates that public broadcast license holders have a duty to present important issues to the public and, here's the fairness part, to give multiple perspectives while doing so. So the FCC had a rule that was decades old when it was canceled in 1987 that said, if you're going to speak on an issue of public importance, you have to give time to the other side to argue the opposite of what you just spoke on. And that was called the Fairness Doctrine. Now, if that sounds like an infringement on freedom of speech, especially on the notion of compelling speech that somebody might not otherwise want to produce, you are correct. I absolutely think it's time to be bringing accountability back to the airwaves, said Michigan Senator Debbie Stabenow, again in 2009. The news has outraged conservatives. So remember, in 2025, this is the opposite of what we're talking about right now. But in 2009, the notion of bringing a Fairness Doctrine back outraged conservatives who see the proposal as a transparent attempt by Democrats to muzzle talk radio bigwigs like Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh. But the latest effort, backed informally by congressional heavyweights, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senator John Kerry, raises old questions about the government's role in regulating the airwaves. See pictures of embarrassing diplomatic moments. Thanks, Time. The act is rooted in the media world of 1949, when lawmakers became concerned that by virtue of their near stranglehold on nationwide TV broadcasting, the three main television networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, could misuse their broadcast licenses to set a biased public agenda. The Fairness Doctrine, which mandated the broadcast networks devote time to contrasting views on issues of public importance, was meant to level the playing field. Congress backed the policy in 1954, and by the 1970s, the FCC called the doctrine the single most important requirement of operation in the public interest, the sine qua non, for that which without which not, for grant of a renewal of license. The Supreme Court proved willing to uphold the doctrine, eking out space for it alongside the First Amendment. All right, we got to talk about that, right? Because if you're hearing this and you've heard me talk in virtual legality and otherwise on this channel, you say, none of this sounds like it's okay with the freedom of speech, Rick. So how does this wind up happening? Well, the Supreme Court makes interesting choices all the time. We've talked about those, certainly. But also, the world of 1969 was not the world of 2025, which is part of this conversation. So in Red Lion Broadcasting Co. versus the FCC, the U.S. Supreme Court holds a number of things, but the most important of which is that the Fairness Doctrine is A-OK. The Fairness Doctrine began shortly after the Federal Radio Commission was established to allocate frequencies among competing applicants in the public interest, and insofar as there is an affirmative obligation of the broadcaster to see that both sides are presented, the personal attack doctrine and regulations do not differ from the Fairness Doctrine. The FCC's statutory mandate is to see that broadcasters operate in the public interest, and Congress's reaffirmation in the 1959 amendment to the Communications Act of the FCC's view that the Fairness Doctrine inhered in the public interest standard support the conclusion that the doctrine and its component personal attack and political editorializing regulations are a legitimate exercise of congressionally delegated authority. So this is still the law of the land. This is not overturned. Red Lion Broadcasting, still how things are today. But we have to look at how the court arrives at this decision to understand why this would likely not back up any FCC move in 2025. So here's how the Supreme Court made its decision. The First Amendment is relevant to public broadcasting, but it is the right of the viewing and listening public and not the right of the broadcasters, which is paramount, that the public has a right to hear both sides. The First Amendment does not protect private censorship by broadcasters, which is what they called it when the ABC, NBCs, and CBSs of the world would refuse to otherwise platform an opposing view. They called it private censorship, who are licensed by the government to use a scarce resource, which is denied to others. Emphasis on scarce resource, right? The year 2025 does not have the same scarcity of getting your voice out there to the world, right? We've got a couple hundred people watching this stream of Reasonable Minds Can Differ right now. We'll have a couple thousand more watch it in archive form, and we'll have probably a few thousand more on top of that. Comment on how much of an idiot I am on Twitter and other social media. This is not the world of 1969. It's certainly not the world of 1954. And so when you see a case like this, which is still quote unquote good law because the Supreme Court has not seen cause to overturn it, primarily because the FCC has not tried to enforce it, then when we talk about these various things, we talk about the dangers of having these kinds of zombie rulings on the books, because the FCC knows that they shouldn't try to enforce all these various things because the world is very different than it used to be. And I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds on this because I don't want to lose you all just reading through a lawsuit that's from the 1960s. But suffice to say, much of their reasoning here is based on the premise that what the FCC is allocating is speech that cannot be combated by other speech, not adequately at least, because the radio waves are so scarce, because there's other people that need to do things with them, and because you can't otherwise fight against ABC going out there and just saying that immigration is bad or the opposite. And so this is not the case in 2025. I firmly believe that if the FCC tried to enforce the Fairness Doctrine today, they would get voided as violation of freedom of speech almost instantaneously. I don't even think there would be a lot of dissent on a Supreme Court case on this topic, which is why you can see me on social media saying when Chairman Carr goes out here and says this about Jimmy Kimmel, when he says a follow-up statement about The View, the talk show on ABC, about whether they need to have a talk with the FCC or otherwise have ABC's license revoked, that this is all bully tactics and they couldn't actually enforce these things if they tried to in an official capacity. That's why you see some of the mobster talk. But this is important because you will see online as part of this conversation, conversations that say, well, the Fairness Doctrine, the equal time rule, which is a concept that's similar to the Fairness Doctrine, but is based specifically around political candidates. Those are all okay under the First Amendment because of Red Lion and other cases. That is true, technically, and very much not true insofar as the reasoning probably doesn't hold up in the modern court. So that's the conversation that is happening a little bit online. And that's the conversation that Chairman Carr of the FCC already knows about, right? He already knows when he's making these assertions that he probably can't enforce any of this crap in the public interest on any of these licensees without getting absolutely beaten down in even the Roberts Court. And if you've been with me on this channel, you know how I feel about Chief Justice Roberts and his handling of difficult decisions in the court. Even in the case of the Roberts Court, I think the Supreme Court just says, no, absolutely not. Not a Fairness Doctrine. We are not going to abide by any of that. It's not 1969. We're overturning Red Line Broadcasting. I don't think there's even a question in my mind about this particular topic. But that's the situation as it stands right now. And that is the 5 propositions I have for you all today, which means it's time for the Difference Dome. That's right. New background, Difference Dome, high production values here on the Hoeg Law YouTube channel. So I hope you're excited about all these things. Right now, I will be starting a Q&A box for you to enter your particular questions and comments on any of the propositions. I'll also summarize them in a screen that goes next to me as well. But I want to make sure I get all these buttons pressed in the right way. So just hang on one second. And then we will take a brief break while you prep your conversations, proposition arguments for the wonderful Difference Dome. So that being said, I do appreciate all of you here watching or listening after the fact. Please consider supporting the channel if you like these conversations on Patreon by having memberships to the channel, by doing super chats or super thanks or anything else that you want to do. All of that support is very, very much appreciated. We're still going through some structural changes. I mentioned it last week. I had not planned on making any videos in September, but I feel like these conversations are really important, and I'm really excited about launching this new show. So if you do like this, please consider supporting us. And then get to telling me why I'm wrong about one or more of these propositions. Please label it as RMCD 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or just general in that Q&A box. I can't put your questions and answers or comments on stream. with that box, but I think it is the best way to organize having this conversation in the future. For right now, we're going to take a few minutes break so that I can rest my voice a little bit before getting into it with you all, and then we will be right back after that. Thank you so much, everybody. All right. Well, thanks everybody for waiting there for just a minute while I got some tea in me. Always nice to refresh the vocal cords a little bit. I really do appreciate it. And I've got a couple questions in the difference dome already, so we're going to see what we can do there. We're also going to see what buttons I can hit to make my setup look a little bit better. But I appreciate everybody waiting on me, figuring out where the buttons might be. There we go. Don't need to be so small on screen. All right, I appreciate everybody. Let's grab the super chats as I promised when the difference dome started. First, we've got Just Because, a member for 38 months. Honestly, my mom watches a lot of Fox News, and their shows cut it off after not one of them. I found that very disingenuous. After the not one of them. Oh, yes, because he has more to say on that particular topic. I think that both sides of the political spectrum have their cable news forces that are designed around presenting only one side of the world, right? One, Reasonable Minds Can Differ, a video topic that I might do in the future is something like two worlds, one family as a concept, which is this notion of these independent bubbles existing that we can talk about that I might want to have more of a conversation on. I haven't decided yet. I don't know how often these episodes are really going to be, but I knew I wanted to talk about free speech as soon as I saw all of this bubbling over. Thank you so much for being a member for so long. And 40 Doherty, thank you so much for the super chat. Angels on a Pinhead. Yes, it's an old philosophical discussion point, right? That there's not a real reason to discuss how many angels could fit on the end of a pin. And so when I say it's all angels on the head of a pin, I mean that it's not useful to go over as a specific didactic device on whatever topic we are talking about. So that's when I use a saying like that, you can probably Google it and find the description. I think it's like an old, I want to say like Catholic Church philosophical concept, but that's what I mean when I say that kind of thing. So thank you so much for the super chat and for supporting conversations like these. Let's see if I can otherwise bring up some of the difference zone. Katie Cotton asks, hey, Hoeg, do you really think that the Supreme Court would rule 9-0 against regulating offensive speech on TV, not curse words? Meaning that if the FCC tried to enforce the Fairness Doctrine in 2025, that the Supreme Court would say, no, that's obviously a violation of the First Amendment here in 2025. I think that that's probably something like a 7-2, in all honesty. But I don't think it would be a strong 2 on the dissent. I'm not sure that would be a really long-worded argument on that particular topic. But that's how I think it would probably go. 9-0 is hard to get to on all but the most kind of boring procedural elements in the Supreme Court. But I don't think that you'd have a realistic shoot-and war type argument at the Supreme Court level on that topic. That's what I really think. And I have absolutely no faith in Chief Justice Roberts for corralling any part or portion of the court. But I think that's as obvious as it gets that the FCC is not going to try to enforce the Fairness Doctrine, at least without congressional mandate, right? We've got a lot of Supreme Court jurisprudence now in 2025 talking about the major questions doctrine, which is to say that the Supreme Court is unwilling to allow these various agencies and bodies to make determinations on their own that Congress did not put in black letter law in whatever statute they authorized the commission or agency that we're talking about under. So if the FCC were just to decide right now, Fairness Doctrine's back, baby, you have to present both sides of every issue in all contexts, then the Supreme Court's going to look at that and say, that is compelled speech under our jurisprudence over the last 60 years. We have an internet now, so what are you talking about, bro, vis-a-vis scarce resources? And that's how I think that case would ultimately go. That's my opinion. We don't have it in front of us. The Supreme Court has not taken it up because the FCC is not stupid enough to actually try to enforce it. Because one thing the agencies are very good at is keeping the zombie rules and laws and regulations on the books, because they know when it's unlikely that they're going to win the day in court. So they just don't enforce them all the way. They just threaten to enforce them because the private actors like these networks, even like these affiliates, they don't know. They can't make their bets on their entire livelihood and all the capital resources they've invested in on the notion that these 9 robed figures in Washington are going to decide on their behalf, right? When you're making these choices as a business, it's different than Hoeg just shouting things at you on YouTube. So that's what creates all of this chilling effect in the world, is that the chairman of the FCC is going out there and saying, oh yeah, we could enforce this. You don't know. We absolutely could. How do you invest in your network and affiliate infrastructure if you think the FCC could just at some point decide they're going to enforce this against you, and then you're depending your entire business model on Chief Justice John Roberts, for God's sakes? That's tough. You got to go to your board and say, oh no, Roberts is going to have our back. Roberts has nobody's back. We don't know for sure. Hoeg says it's going to be fine. Who is Hoeg? What are you talking about right now? No, don't do this. The chairman of the FCC is threatening us. You listen to that, and you listen to his mobsters, and you figure out how to run this business. Nashay's an Extraordinary Machine says, isn't this whole mishigas with Kimmel the kind of speech that is specifically protected by the First Amendment? Yes, this is a good point. So Jimmy Kimmel's jokes here, if we're being generous, I'm not sure there's actual jokes in that content that we read out earlier, but hey, all of late night sucks. That's not really a political statement, and it's not a separate proposition. They just are all bad at their jobs at this point. Jimmy Kimmel's statements, funny or not, are certainly of a political stripe, right? They're talking about MAGA. They're talking about an assassination of a political figure. They're talking about these things that are of the highest and most supreme importance in the conversation in any governance, but certainly in the United States. And the First Amendment, when we look at all of the jurisprudence on it in the courts, or even outside the courts in the regulatory agencies, the most protected speech is speech that is adjacent to politics, the polity, policy, however you want to describe it, the things that we care about when we talk about politics with a big P. And so when we're talking about this particular issue, Jimmy Kimmel is probably the most protected on these kinds of things than he would be on saying anything else, right? When we talk about things that are less protected, we talk about commercial speech. We talk about things that are obscene or could be seen as obscene, that some pieces of society don't want to see at all. But politics and talking about these various things, whether or not they're actually funny, whether or not they're actually fully truthful or not, these are the things that the First Amendment is most established to protect. That when we talk about why it's important to have freedom of speech, it's because it's important to talk about issues of policy and politics. So Nashay's an extraordinary machine. You are exactly right. That's not a difference in the difference dome, but hey, I appreciate the comment. Ray XYZ on proposition number 5 that the FCC did threaten speech says, do you see a push for more of this to happen in the near future? I look at so many internet regulations around the world, and I worry soon enough there won't be much freedom in the online space. I see the governments of the world, regardless of whether you want to frame them as right-wing or left-wing or whatever is the proper way to think about these things in your jurisdiction of choice, I see it as more along the lines of what Ray XYZ is describing, that it's really a kind of government versus the non-government, right? I've said this a lot in virtual legality, that the thing that the politicians on red and blue, Republicans and Democrats, seem to agree on the most in the United States is that they really hate big tech. They really hate big technology. Why? I would argue it's primarily because big technology affords the populace, the people, the most voice against what government wants to have happen. Whether that's on Team Red or Team Blue, it doesn't really matter so much. They are together Team B ruled, and everybody else is on the opposite side. So I do think there are pushes for these things. I think Europe in particular is an enormously worrying jurisdiction to see how they are treating the internet and engaging with it. Whether it's disinformation boards or various steps that places in like the UK are taking, I think there is a lot to be concerned with there. I would sit here in the United States and say we need to be a bulwark against that kind of censorship, because this is the best way to get the most voices out there. That is how we get the best ideas. And yes, with the best ideas, you're going to get a lot of stuff that you don't like. You're going to get a lot of people saying things that aren't things that you want to hear. But ultimately, that freedom is how we get to the best governance. It's how we get to the most self-actualization as human beings. And if the government is scared of it, then ultimately, I think that's probably a good thing. Newspin, thank you for being a member for so long, says, aren't there a lot of restrictions for the big four networks that restrict speech, but have often been overlooked due to the opinions matching the party most of the past 16 years? Said another way is, if you are otherwise agreeing with what the government wants you to say, aren't we just missing that there's probably been these pressures all along because you were already swimming within the lanes that they provided to you? I think that's probably right, that there was always a willingness to go out there and enforce these various things if you got out of line, right? The Time article that we read, I picked out from 2009, one, because I think it spins your head a little bit to see the Republicans and Democrats on the exact opposite side of what they are today, but also as a note that each side is for freedom of speech, primarily when they're out of power, and seemingly against freedom of speech when they're in power. Why? Because the government doesn't love to be told that they're doing something wrong. That's just the case. That's the reality of the situation. So I do think that as more and more of the media infrastructure has leaned in one direction in the United States, that they probably weren't getting the same amount of direct pressure from the government because it was understood that they were going in the direction that the government already wanted. That's not good either way, right? I shouldn't be here as a lawyer saying that's how I think things probably went when we're talking about media broadcasting. But I do think that there is a long history of the media leaning in one direction and not the other. We can argue about whether or not that's a good thing at the end of the day. But I do think that is in fact the case. The existence of the FCC is one of those things that helps get us to that place, right? So we should probably be talking about whether the FCC that governs the granting of government monopolies over the air broadcasts is a fully necessary entity as it stands today in the world of 2025 with broadband, with the internet, with all these various ways to talk to each other. I don't know. I can't speak to that directly, but I know that I do feel that there are a lot of agencies and a lot of powers and a lot of laws on the books that maybe aren't fully speaking necessary, that probably do need to be reformed in some form or fashion before we get too far afield from the freedoms that we're supposed to enjoy. Okay, let's see. What else we got? Michigan Farm Boy says, I'm generally conservative, and I'm concerned about AG Bondi talking about hate speech, FCC intimidation. I didn't like it when the left was pushing hate speech, and I don't like it from the right. Well, Michigan Farm Boy, I am glad that you are a person of principle on this. I think one of the things that really gets lost in the kind of tribal politicization of the online internet community in, again, 2025 is that it's okay if the team wearing my uniform color is for it, and it's bad if they're against it. But if we're really honest with ourselves, principles should matter more than politics. Principles should matter more than parties. And if you're in favor of the freedom of speech and in the United States not having a separate categorization of hate speech, then what A.G. Bondi said last week should put the fear of God in you, right? Like, that's not what your government should be doing. That's not how the United States has ever been structured. And the Europeans that watch this show or otherwise listen to it after the fact will tell you that they treat freedom of speech very differently, and they have these kinds of hate speech carve-outs. Reasonable minds can differ on how the freedom of speech should operate in a just society. But in the United States, I think it's very important that we not make that distinction, because it puts too much power in the hands of a government, its agencies, or its chairmen and chair people like Carr to decide what's acceptable and not acceptable for people to hear. S. QWERTY, who gets to decide what JK meant, Jimmy Kimmel, you read it that he was implying the shooter was MAGA. I don't think there's another way to read it, in all honesty. I and others saw it a different way. I'd be happy if you want to offer what way you saw it. It can be interpreted both ways, but is it interpretation or intent that matters? In this particular case, it doesn't matter, right? He has the freedom to speak those things. The fact that the FCC comes out and says he shouldn't be saying those things is a problem in and of itself, regardless of whether you read it the way that I think it's intended to be read or the opposite. So I think I agree with you on this. I don't think that there's a difference here as much as who gets to decide. That's the problem with hate speech laws. That's the problem with the overall conversation that we're talking about, which is to say, who watches the watchers? Who gets to make this determination? The reason that freedom of speech is so important in the United States, the reason we don't have that hate speech delineation here, is because we don't trust anyone to make that determination. We don't trust anybody sitting on high in Washington or anywhere else to say you should not hear that thing. And when we get closer to that line, we have all sorts of trouble, and which is why I'm making this video here. Jack Sleep says, do Americans here feel like democracy is in some sort of danger or no? Things are looking grim from a European perspective. I can't speak for all Americans, Jack Sleeps. I really can't. I do not think democracy is in danger. One of the comments to last week's first episode of Reasonable Minds Can Differ was that I was not mean enough to the Trump administration on the use of terms like fascist and Nazi, and that I needed to be meaner on that. And my comment was that I didn't really see the analogies there, and I do think it's dehumanizing and enables the type of violence that we saw when we were discussing Charlie Kirk's assassination in last week's episode. But I just truly don't see that, and I think we need to be very careful about, oh, this person is a threat to democracy, because that reads very much like an existential danger. And I would ask people to more watch what politicians or our betters or our CEOs or however you want to frame it actually do. Look at their revealed preferences through their actions more than what they say, because rhetoric is damning, and rhetoric is used by all sides of the political spectrum to try to get you to hate another and dehumanize the opposite side so that you can do what it is that they want to do with their political power. So be careful with that stuff. I don't think there is an active threat to democracy. I don't think there's an active constitutional crisis. I think there are things we can be worried about. There are lines that could be crossed that I might change my tune on. And there are certainly dispositions that I don't like when I observe the Trump administration, J.D. Vance, Chairman Carr, and various things that say, okay, you're thinking about this the wrong way. So I think that there are things that legitimate people, reasonable minds, can look at and say, I'm really, really concerned about that, where I don't actually share that same concern as it stands right now. But reasonable minds can differ. That's what this whole conversation is about. Michigan Farm Boy coming back with another one. Are you concerned about some judges lacking concern or prioritizing judicial efficiency, avoiding the disruption from changing rescheduling over the appearance of impropriety? I have all sorts of concerns about the judiciary in America in 2025, right? I have concerns at the Chief Justice Roberts level. I have concerns at the lower levels. There are a lot of people out there that seem less concerned about preserving the rule of law in our society as a peaceful body politic than they are about making their point about the Trump administration or anything else in politics today. Judges need to be above all of that. And I'm sorry to say they appear to be not quite up to the task as it stands right this moment. Michigan Farm Boy again, the FCC threat is similar to police authority being a threat that you may win in the end, Supreme Court, but the government can still punish you with the processing cost. Right. I have actually said in the past that one of the phrases that I really think is effective is the process is the punishment, right? You don't want to be arrested. You don't want to go through processing. You don't want to go through a court case. In the less criminal side of things, you don't actually want to be defending your use of another YouTube clip as fair use, because by the time you're in court and you're bringing up an affirmative defense that your use was fair, You've already paid for a lawyer. You've already gone through all of the stress of being sued over something, potentially losing your livelihood. And even if you win at the end, you don't get that time back. You don't get that time back. You don't get that cost back. The only people that make money are the lawyers in those particular conversations. And while I am a lawyer and I'm perfectly happy to see my colleagues make money, it doesn't do much for the defendant when they've gone through that whole process, even if they're vindicated in the end. So yes, the process is the punishment. It's very similar. The FCC saying, shame if anything would happen to your license, means there's a chilling effect, if nothing else, that ABC and Disney have to really think about what it is that they let Jimmy Kimmel say, what they're demanding of him tonight. I do think it'll be interesting to see if he has a kind of droopy dog type apology for what's happened here, whether he is defiant in the face of all of this. I don't know how he's going to treat this. I don't know whether Disney knows how he's going to treat all this. I think it is interesting. I suspect that he will have at least a blip of a ratings increase for people seeing exactly how he treats this at the very start. But ultimately, yes, the process is the punishment. We should not be in favor of our government or any other government acting as mobsters on rules and authority that they almost certainly do not have, even if there's a case in the 60s and one in the early 70s that suggests that at one point in time, they maybe did have that power. So that's the situation as it stands today. I think I have cleared the difference dome of questions right now. I am disappointed in you all for not differing with me and telling me I'm an idiot on more things, but I really appreciate all of your conversations today and being a part of these videos. I'm really, really excited about what Reasonable Minds Can Differ can be, what it can mean to so many people. I'm going to look to see if we can't do some clips from this show, maybe some edits that can be more accessible to people that don't want to sit in for a full hour-long episode. I have a lot of thoughts about how we could proceed with this format. I'm so happy for the few hundred people that have joined me for the first couple of episodes here in deciding to join me on these very difficult issues in a format that doesn't necessarily lead to the most detailed conversation, but that is worth having, even if we can't get to the perfect answer for all difficult conversations that we might have in our lives. Thank you so much for being here. I am so appreciative of all of you, and I will see you on the next episode of Reasonable Minds Can Differ.